Hello and welcome to the Danny4 Foundation's podcast, where we talk about the ocean, the beating blue heart of our planet, the blue economy, transparency, accountability and good governance, leadership and gender, and youth. I'm your host, Larry Chetty. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking to the former Deputy Executive Secretary for Corporate Affairs at the Southern African Development Community, SADC, Ambassador Joseph Nourrice. We will be talking about the youth of Africa in the context of sustainable development. The AU Agenda 2063 and UN Agenda 2030 recognize youth as vital in shaping Africa's future. Their active involvement ensures that youth voices and aspirations are considered at all decision-making levels. So I asked Ambassador Nourrice on the role of the youth towards achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
I think the agenda of UN Sustainable Development Goal, SDG as we call them, and this was carved in a way so as to be inclusive in a number of ways, in a number of manners. We have 169 targets and also the indicators 247. It's quite a lot actually. And where the youth fit in, because we're talking of sustainable development. And you cannot talk of sustainable development without the inclusion of the youth. So there have been several measures that have been taken to include the youth, because you cannot ignore the youth, because it forms a big majority of the African population. So if we're talking of SDG, and by 2030, the African youth are expected to make up 42% of the world population. So it is a huge chunk. And in 35 years' time in Africa, the youth population will be 75%. So it is really a huge chunk of human capital. And this is the type of human capital we have to develop, because the youth of today are to be, the leaders and the future of tomorrow. So it is very important, therefore, that has been included in the agenda. And I think the continent itself should be gearing itself in order to benefit from what they have called the demographic dividends of young people that will energize and that will sort of catapult development on the continent.
From your former position as Deputy Executive Secretary for Corporate Affairs at SADC, have you seen any programs that include the youth that will gear towards the youth, empowering them to become leaders of tomorrow and to, like you said, take advantage of this demographic dividend?
Yes, I think there have been not only in the SADC region, but also on the African continent. And I think there are quite a number of initiatives that have been launched, be it in terms of education, be it in terms of involvement in community development, leadership, and so forth. There has been a lot of initiative. But the question is that are those initiatives being sort of measured, monitored, to see that they align with the goals and the targets that have been set. And I think this is something that we need to really delve into, so that if there is any sort of misalignment, so that it is brought back to traction. So yes, there has been, but whether there is enough to bring us up to the 2030 timeline that we have set, I think this is something that needs serious interrogation.
And we all know that perhaps Africa has many challenges in various sectors or areas. How do these challenges affect the way forward into capitalizing on the youth for sustainable development?
I think maybe one of the biggest challenges maybe that Africa faces is that of infrastructure. And in infrastructure in all its aspects. Various initiatives have been put in place, but we know that, for instance, in Seychelles, maybe we do not see that much. But when you go on the continent, you see that road, water, electricity. These are the infrastructure that needs to be upgraded, to be improved, to be provided. because you would see people going kilometers to try and get water, for instance. So it's not something that we in Seychelles experience. But in some part of our continent, of the African continent, these are the things. And issue of education. So maybe these are the things that, here we take it for granted, but I've visited places where, teachers do not have the facilities. In some extreme cases where you would even have teachers and a class which is outside under a tree. It's amazing to see the enthusiasm of both pupil and teacher they put into it. So maybe that is something that I need to echo for our youth here. We have the facilities, so please let us endeavor to use them correctly for our own development, for the development of our country.
This is the Danny4 Foundation podcast. The former Executive Secretary of SADC, Ambassador Joseph Nourrice, is discussing the role of youth towards achieving sustainable development. Although there have been various initiatives to involve youth in sustainable development, especially in Africa, good governance and effective leadership are also important elements to consider. Ambassador Nourrice is of the view that governance remains a challenge in some African countries.
I think one of the problems is that in some parts of the continent, governance may still be a problem. It still exists a problem. And we have seen that there had been a number of cases where the youths have felt that they have been marginalized. And then this is where you start having, the problems there. And this is why I was saying that its inclusion is very important. I'm glad here that you have the youth parliament trying to give them that mentoring. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see the former youth speaker and very eloquent, in the way. And also we do have those on the continent. But one of the main things on the continent that even at meetings where you have heard that people saying, we are not being given enough opportunities for us to participate. But my take also on it is that when opportunities are given, do the youth make full use of it? Because these are the opportunities and you are entrusted with responsibility. And then it is also a build-up for you to later on to take up other position for the development of the country. We're talking of sustainable development. So you need succession, you need all these things. So, and the youth have to be mentored. And do they come forward when entrusted with those responsibility to do that diligently and so forth? So in terms of governance, the African Union, yes, they have, the governance architecture, which is there. But again, is how effective it is. I'm not too sure, but these are the things that are examined, I think, on a yearly basis, during the summit and so forth. You have the APRM mechanism, and these are the mechanisms, the institute, the frameworks that will say, okay, I think it's going at 100%, not really 100%, or 70, 60% in some quarters. There are evaluations that are made annually, but I'm not in a position for me just to say how effective, they are.
And in conclusion, what would be your message for the youth of Africa and Seychelles, of course?
I believe for Africa, I think there are opportunities. The youth have to work hard, very hard. It reminds me of a saying which said, if you train a child in the way he should go, then when he's old, he will keep on to it. I think that is in Proverbs. Proverbs is a book of wisdom. It's just not only on the youth. It is also the community where they are. It is also the framework that exists to be able to capture the youths so that they become very useful members of society. And working hard is very, very important. Applying is very, very important. But I think there had been some issues in certain quarters. For instance, I was in one of the countries and was going round, and I saw a big graduation ceremony that was taking place in a huge hall. And I think it would have been about 3,000 graduates. And then I said, wow, that is amazing. And the person who was there, he said, they are graduating for unemployment. It's a little bit cynical, maybe he has gone a little bit far, but these are not the hopes that the youth who have graduated expect, you see. These are some of the challenges that we have, as I've said, but for them is to continue working hard and to show themselves up to the challenges. Challenges always happen, but I think as a group, the youth have a lot. I know that there is a youth group in the African Union, the youth ambassadors. So a lot of work is being done there. But for me, it's just you have to keep on knocking. You have to keep on working very hard. And it is just no good for you to criticize, as young people, especially now on social media. Those sort of comments that are not productive in a way, you have a right to say, but say it in a manner that whoever is in leadership hears it, but not in an arrogant manner and to demean. These platforms exist, and so the youth have to be conscious of that, and I believe they would eventually make their way into the mainstream. But I also insist that there's a saying, if you see a tree, if you are today under a shed, remember that the tree was planted a long, long time ago. So therefore, what we are saying is, what legacy do you intend to leave? As a youth, you have to grow. You start young as a group, as a young person. And then at the end of the day, you have to leave a legacy. One of the problems maybe that we also have in Seychelles now is youth, and the economic labor force is a little bit decimated now because of the drug issue. So these are the things that, we have to, in Seychelles specifically, I know a lot of efforts are being placed into it, but this poses problems in terms of cost of treatment, the sort of labor force where we have to bring in foreigners, expatriate, and with foreigners also, which has an impact on our infrastructure, and also foreign exchange leaves one day. So these are the things that the youth have to be cognizant and rise up so that we can together address the challenges that we face. It is a global challenge, but youth of Seychelles, let us come together so that we can also give a hand so as to make Seychelles a better place. They will leave Seychelles a better place than when we found it.
That was the former Deputy Executive Secretary for Corporate Affairs at SADC talking to the Danny4 Foundation podcast on the role of the youth in Africa in the context of sustainable development. In our next episode, we speak to Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados. She talks about democracy in the Caribbean.
I would say if we talk about the development of democracy in the Caribbean, broadly speaking, the key thing to understand is that we have consolidated in a sense as democracies. As to whether or not it is the kind of democracy that is ideal, when we understand what 21st century democracy is all about, that is a different issue altogether.
Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles on democracy in the Caribbean in our next episode of the Danny4 Foundation podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Podbean, Spotify, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, or Apple Podcast to keep up to date with weekly episodes. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.